Something happened overnight that Moscow did not want the world to see. While most of Europe was sleeping, Ukrainian drones punched through Russian air defenses and struck a steel fabrication factory in Chekhov, a town sitting right inside Moscow Oblast. Not the borderlands, not some distant province, Moscow Oblast. The factory hit was the Hydrostalkonstruktsiya facility, a steel construction plant the Russian military has depended on for infrastructure production, and the strike sent shockwaves through Russian telegram channels within minutes of impact. Governor Andrei Vorobyov confirmed the attack, acknowledging drone debris had ignited a residential building and set fires in the nearby village of Vaulovo. Russian air defenses were active all night. They claimed kills, they claimed intercepts, but the factory still burned. And that tells you everything you need to know about where this war is right now. Welcome back. I'm Ben Hodges, and what I'm about to walk you through in the next several minutes is not just a rundown of overnight events. What we're looking at right now is the maturation of a Ukrainian strategic campaign unlike anything we've seen since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. Ukraine is no longer reacting to Russia. Ukraine is driving the tempo of this conflict, and that is a fundamental shift that too many analysts are still failing to appreciate. So let's go through it carefully. Let's go through it with the rigor this situation demands. Start with what happened in the last 24 hours, and then pull back to see the bigger operational picture. Because the Chekhov strike is not an isolated event. It is one data point in a sustained, deliberate, and increasingly precise deep strike campaign that Ukraine has been running throughout the summer of 2026. And when you lay all the data points together, a very clear strategic logic emerges. On July 27th, Ukrainian drones struck the Rostov-on-Don export terminal on Russia's Black Sea coast. President Zelensky confirmed this personally, posting video of the port facility ablaze. The Rostov Oblast governor reported 2 people killed and 5 injured. That same night, Ukrainian drones also reached oil facilities in Russia's Udmurtia Republic and Yaroslavl Oblast, both northeast of Moscow, more than 1,300 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. Let me say that again, 1,300 kilometers. Ukraine is now reaching deep into the Russian heartland with sufficient payload and precision to destroy the infrastructure that keeps the Russian war machine running. And they did it on the same night they were also striking Belgorod, where 12 people were injured and a residential building set ablaze along with 15 parked vehicles. Now on July 28th, as I'm speaking to you, the overnight waves have continued. The Chekhov industrial strike near Moscow, and simultaneously, and this is the part that carries enormous strategic weight, occupied Crimea went dark again. A blackout was reported across the peninsula following Ukrainian drone strikes overnight. This is not the first time. This is not even close to the first time. Throughout July, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces have struck 154 targets across Crimea in a single month. 154 confirmed strikes in 30 days. Commander Robert Magyar Brovdy confirmed the numbers himself. The stated goal is to make Russia's hold on Crimea militarily and logistically untenable. When you look at the pattern, power substations, military air bases, fuel depots, naval infrastructure, port facilities, you start to understand this is not random. Ukraine is executing a methodical campaign to strangle the peninsula. Now here is the analysis that most people are missing. What Ukraine is doing to Crimea and to Russian energy infrastructure deep inside Russia proper is not simply kinetic punishment. It is a strategic effort to force Russia to make impossible choices with finite resources. Every time a power substation in Crimea goes dark, Russia has to divert engineers, repair crews, equipment, and budget to restore it. Every time a drone reaches a logistics hub in Moscow Oblast, Russian commanders have to pull air defense assets away from the front lines to protect the rear. And this is happening while Russia is simultaneously trying to sustain offensive pressure along a front line that stretches roughly 1,000 kilometers across eastern and southern Ukraine. That is an extraordinary strain on any military, and Russia's military is not in the kind of shape the Kremlin's propaganda machine wants its domestic audience to believe. Let's talk about the ground situation, because the front lines tell a story that the Kremlin is desperately trying to spin. Russia has been pushing hard toward Kostyantynivka in the Donetsk region for months. They have been using their classic infiltration tactic, small assault groups probing Ukrainian defenses, finding weak points, going to ground, waiting for reinforcements. It is methodical, it is grinding, and it is extraordinarily costly in Russian lives. The Center for Strategic and International Studies calculated that Russian forces advanced roughly 10 miles toward Kostyantynivka between August of 2025 and early June of 2026. 10 miles in 10 months. That's about 165 feet per day. That is not a blitzkrieg. That is not a war-winning operational pace. That is a slow, bloody, attritional crawl that is consuming Russian manpower at a rate that should terrify anyone in the Kremlin who does the math honestly. In early July, Russia's defense ministry claimed it had captured Kostyantynivka. General Gerasimov personally delivered the announcement to Putin on television. Putin praised the troops involved and called it a significant strategic achievement. There is one problem with that. It is not true. Independent battlefield mapping, testimony from Ukrainian troops still fighting inside the city, and verified video evidence all contradict the Russian claim. What actually happened is that Russian forces managed to get assault teams into portions of the city, not control it, not administer it, not hold it in any meaningful military sense. They planted flags. They filmed videos. They fed the domestic propaganda machine. But Ukrainian forces of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade are still fighting there, and according to the brigade's own commander, they are doing so at a loss ratio of roughly 3 Ukrainians to 53 Russians. 3 to 53. Even if you discount those numbers by a significant margin for battlefield reporting bias, the ratio is still staggeringly in Ukraine's favor. Russia is paying an enormous price for every block it attempts to hold in that city. Meanwhile, Ukraine's general staff reported 232 combat engagements along the front in a single 24-hour period. That tells you the density of fighting across the entire line of contact. And the Institute for the Study of War assessed that Russia's overall rate of advance in summer 2026 remains well below the pace they maintained during 2024 and 2025. The momentum that Russia built during that period, the momentum that caused so much alarm in Western capitals, has largely stalled. Russia is still making incremental gains. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But the character of those gains has changed fundamentally. They are smaller, slower, more costly, and strategically far less significant than what we saw 12 months ago. That is a direct result of Ukraine's sustained deep strike campaign, degrading Russian logistics, fuel supply, and command infrastructure. Let's talk about the maritime dimension because it's getting far less coverage than it deserves. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces ran what they called the 13-day Molochka maritime interdiction campaign earlier this month, claiming strikes on 172 Russian Shadow Fleet vessels. That Shadow Fleet, the armada of aging, often uninsured tankers Russia uses to evade Western oil sanctions and keep petroleum revenues flowing, is one of the Kremlin's primary mechanisms for sustaining its war budget. Every vessel that gets damaged or destroyed, every shipping route that becomes too dangerous for these tankers to navigate, is another blow to Russia's ability to fund the conflict. And there's a cascading effect here. Ukrainian commanders stated that forcing Russia to protect its shipping is pulling up to 200 groups of Rubicon elite drone units and associated air defense assets away from the front line. 200. That's a significant diversion of high-value Russian military capability away from the battlefield where it matters most. Now let me give you something the mainstream coverage largely skipped over. 2 to 3 weeks ago, Ukraine struck 2 logistics centers in Moscow and Tambov Oblasts in a single night. Those logistics centers were supplying drone components and navigation equipment to Russian forces on the front lines. And the strikes included 2 fulfillment centers of online retail giant Wildberries, warehouses Russia was reportedly using for military logistics concealed within commercial supply chains. The estimated damage exceeded 100 billion rubles, roughly 1.2 billion US dollars, in a single night. $1.2 billion in one night. And then Russian workers, business owners, and ordinary citizens began appearing on Russian social media, describing fear, financial ruin, and growing anger at the Kremlin. That last part is significant. Because the psychological impact of the deep strike campaign on Russian domestic morale is an effect that is genuinely difficult to quantify, but absolutely real. Here's what I want you to understand about the strategic picture as we stand on July 28, 2026. This war is now well into its fifth year of full-scale combat. Russia has occupied roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. In 2025 alone, Russia gained nearly 5,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian land. Those are hard, painful facts. Ukraine is not in a comfortable position. Nobody should pretend otherwise. But the trajectory of the last 60 to 90 days tells a different story than the raw territorial numbers suggest. Ukraine has wrested back the initiative in ways that matter enormously for long-term military sustainability. The deep strike campaign is degrading Russian energy revenues, straining Russian logistics, forcing Russian air defense assets to defend the homeland instead of protecting frontline forces, and delivering a psychological message to the Russian population that this war is not the clean, distant special military operation the Kremlin sold them in February of 2022. And while all of this is happening on the battlefield, the diplomatic environment has also been shifting. A brief Easter truce in April 2026 lasted 32 hours. Both sides violated it repeatedly. Peace talks have been whispered about in various formats: Trump administration officials, Kremlin envoys, Ukrainian delegations, but no serious framework has emerged. Putin's position remains unchanged. He wants territorial concessions codified, he wants NATO commitments scaled back, and he wants international recognition of what Russia currently occupies. Zelensky's position is equally clear: no territorial concessions without a security guarantee structure that is airtight, and no negotiations conducted under the barrel of ongoing Russian strikes on Ukrainian civilians. That's not rhetoric. That's a politically sustainable position for a leader whose country has lost tens of thousands of fighters and has nearly 10 million people displaced. 60% of Russians, according to recent polling, say they support peace negotiations. 66% of Ukrainians say they believe their government should seek to negotiate an end to the war as soon as possible. Those numbers are striking. They tell you that war fatigue is real and deep on both sides of this conflict. But wanting peace and being able to agree on the terms of peace are two entirely different things. And right now, the gap between what Moscow will accept and what Kyiv can politically survive accepting remains extraordinarily wide. Which brings me to the role of the West, and specifically the question of what happens next with weapons and support packages. The European Union has already disbursed the first $3.4 billion of a $101 billion loan to Ukraine. That financial architecture matters enormously for Ukraine's long-term capacity to sustain this fight. Britain's new Prime Minister Burnham has met with Zelensky and pledged stone-cloaked defense technology to Kyiv, a gesture that signals continued European commitment even as the political winds in some capitals remain complicated. And NATO, as an institution, is increasingly focused on counter-drone investment, reportedly working toward a $40 billion plan in direct response to the lessons Ukraine's campaign has taught about the decisive role of unmanned systems in modern warfare. Let me bring you back to the human cost, because in any analysis worth taking seriously, you cannot lose sight of it. 4 civilians were killed in Russian attacks across the Donetsk region on July 27th alone. Among the wounded was an 11-month-old baby. Across Odessa region, 28 people have been killed by Russian strikes in July alone. A civilian ship near Odessa, a Guinea-Bissau flagged vessel carrying corn, crewed by sailors from India and Syria, was struck by Russian forces. 10 people were killed. 8 crew members were rescued. That vessel had nothing to do with the war. It was carrying grain. The same kind of attack on civilian shipping that drew international condemnation when it began years ago has now become a routine feature of Russia's maritime aggression. And the world's attention has moved on. Meanwhile, in Russia, the overnight drone strikes are hitting towns and cities that ordinary Russian families call home. Residential buildings in Chekhov, cars burning in Belgorod, families in Rostov-on-Don woken by explosions. I am not going to draw a moral equivalence between what Russia has done systematically and deliberately to Ukrainian civilians over 4.5 years and Ukraine's legitimate military targeting of Russian military and dual-use infrastructure. Those are not equivalent. But I want you to understand the full scope of what this war now looks like from both sides of the border, because this is no longer a conflict that either side can pretend is clean or contained. Here is my bottom line assessment as of July 28, 2026. Ukraine is fighting this war in a strategically sophisticated way that deserves far more recognition than it receives. The deep strike campaign is working. Not perfectly, not decisively, but it is working. It is squeezing Russian logistics and fuel supply. It is diverting Russian military resources away from the front. It is sustaining international attention on Russian vulnerability. And it is demonstrating to every military planner on the planet that small, cheap, autonomous systems deployed in mass numbers can hold larger conventional forces accountable across enormous distances. That is a lesson with implications that go far beyond this war. Russia, meanwhile, is demonstrating something equally important and equally uncomfortable. It is demonstrating that a large nation with significant industrial capacity and sufficient political will to absorb losses can sustain a grinding offensive at costs that would have been considered unacceptable by Western standards. 35,000 dead or wounded per month, according to Western officials citing Ukrainian claims. If even half of that figure is accurate, the human toll inside the Russian military is catastrophic. And yet the offensive continues. Not at the pace it once did, not with the momentum it once carried, but it continues. And that means this war is not ending soon, regardless of what either side says at any negotiating table. What happens in the next 30 days matters enormously. Watch the Kostiantynivka battle, not whether Russia claims it, but whether Ukraine can stabilize its defensive lines there, or whether the city becomes what Toretsk became, a city slowly hollowed out by relentless infiltration until defense becomes untenable. Watch the Crimea campaign, whether Ukraine can push blackouts and infrastructure destruction to a point where the military utility of the peninsula is genuinely compromised. Watch the maritime campaign, whether the shadow fleet losses start showing up in Russian energy revenue figures. Watch the diplomatic track, whether Trump administration pressure produces any framework that both Kiev and Moscow can even theoretically engage with without immediately walking away. And keep watching this channel, because these are the questions this war demands answers to. This is not a frozen conflict. This is not a stalemate. This is a dynamic, high-intensity struggle between two nations that have both committed to fighting until the conditions they need are within reach. As of this morning, neither side has those conditions, and that means the drones will keep flying, the artillery will keep firing, and the people of Ukraine will keep paying the price for a war they did not start but are determined to survive. Stay with us.